Okay, well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back people who are around the world online. I gather that we had people from Nova Scotia and Algeria, as well as Britain last night. So, and continue to let us know where you are by filling in on the chat line. And as we said before, we're not going to have questions after the lectures today. We're saving them all up for the end of the last lecture tomorrow. But please feel free online to type in your questions. And we'll deal with as many of them as possible. And so we have been treated. Oh, well, I also have to add that there may be some sounds off because there has been a marching band going along the street. And sadly, it's not a kind of Zydeco marching band that you get in New Orleans. But if you hear banging and flutes and stuff, that's what it is. So it is my very, very great pleasure to welcome back Professor Theresa Singleton to continue her series of Rhind Lectures. And now she's going to tell us about digging through museum collections, a topic dear to my heart.
A lot of people really aren't aware of the fact that I actually spent so much time working in museums from the very beginning of entering graduate school, or actually before graduate school, I knew I wanted to work in a museum. And in part, it was something that I had lived with all my life. My father would take me regularly to the Charleston Museum, which was founded in 1773 and actually is the oldest museum in colonial North America. And in fact, if you Google it, it'll say it's the oldest museum in the Americas. I'm not sure that's the case, but it certainly is the oldest museum in North America. And I have these two images of the Charleston Museum. The one with the exhibit shows it was very much in the same, put together in the same vein as the British Museum, and at least the founders of it wanted to emulate the British Museum on a smaller scale, and so they had collections from the classical world. But also they also had some early ethnographic materials as well. In fact, I think the oldest object actually comes from the Pacific, and it is an 18th century object, so it would have been there like shortly after Drake went to, or was it, yeah, Drake went to the Pacific. And then this other image is of the building the Charleston Museum was in when I was a child. It was built in the 1870s. So I spent a year at the Charleston Museum right after getting my PhD, and actually the sort of deal I made with them was that if I got funding, my own funding, to come there for a year, would they let me work there so I could get the ropes, learn the ropes of being a museum professional? Of course, they said, sure, for them that would be, free labor, and probably, they could get me to do some things they wanted to do. And so my main project aren't about the objects, or at least these objects that I'm going to talk about. It was really to help with developing a series of exhibits at the museum that would deal with low country life, in other words, the coastal areas of South Carolina. And then the other thing was to actually develop a proposal. I co-authored a proposal so that we could have a city archaeologist in Charleston, and while we got funding for for that position for a year with the proposal, apparently it never became a city archaeologist of Charleston. It's always been a curator of archaeology that was based at the museum. But while I was there, someone told me about these objects, these badges. I actually saw some of them and became curious about them. And well, first of all, slave hire is a type of labor system that what you find throughout the Americas and in urban situations like Charleston. What they began doing is having some way to record the people who were actually authorized to work for wages, enslaved people that could work for wages. And the slaveholders usually made these arrangements, but in some cases, they also had what they call self-hire, where the enslaved person could go and work for someone for wages and then return a proportion of the wages to the slaveholder. And there were laws specifying the conditions under which this slave hiring should occur. And but Charleston, it seems to have been the only place that actually required the hired person to wear a badge, a metal badge, saying that they were licensed to do the kind of labor that they were doing. And so the badges then helped to regulate slave labor, but it also generated a fair amount of income for the city as well. The badges, and here's, if you could see, there are various shapes. Basically because it was every year they would make new badges, and they had different metal workers that produced them. But each year, people would have to get a badge. The cost for the badge was based on the type of work. So a servant's badge was the least expensive, and more than likely, more people were acquiring the servant's badge more than any other one. And then you have the porter, $2, and then mechanic, and a fruit vendor they called a fruitier. This would be a person who would sell fruit and produce at a market, but also maybe some sweets like pies or that kind of thing. And when I did this initial work, I studied 52 badges from 5 museums, but most of them were the vast majority were from the Charleston Museum. I hadn't shown this slide yet, showing the different types of occupations. So you can see that they're in various shapes, and basically what you had on a badge, it said Charleston, it gave the year, the number that would correspond to a book or a log that had who this enslaved person was that would be wearing this badge, and that this was the kind of work that they were allowed to do. The idea was that it seems like ever since the mid-18th century, there had been concerns that enslaved people were working in Charleston, and the city had no control over who was working, who was allowed to work, who wasn't, and should they be doing this kind of work. And so as it took a long time, but by 1800, they started actually issuing these badges. What motivated me to do this research was that they had been misinterpreted, in the historiography of Charleston slavery. And that's because what people would see a badge that said Fisher or Porter, and they would assume that that was the name of the slave owner, and that this was a way of the slave owner keeping track of the people he or she held in bondage. So I said, well, no, that's not right. I mean, I knew that was the case, and so that sort of motivated me to do this project, to just find out more about the badges and to get some sense of how this whole slave hire system worked in Charleston. And the fruitier badge was the most expensive up until the 1850s. And one reason for that is because there was a lot of concern or controversy over the number of enslaved people involved in selling produce and sweets in the market. And even free blacks were sometimes, at different times, were required to obtain this badge as well. So that was an expensive badge, but one, I believe that if you were licensed to sell produce, you probably could make a fair amount of money. I mean, and depending on how much you had to give back to your slave owner. Basically, the work that I did on badges was published in a collection of essays at South Carolina Antiquaries that was a special edition, or maybe not a special edition, but a thematic edition on urban archaeology, or urban archaeology in Charleston. And so that was the article I published in 1984. And a book, a small monograph was published on it in 2004, so 20 years later. The authors for the monograph, they pointed out that I was really surprised that they acknowledged my work, but they also talked about my work in favorable terms throughout the book. And one thing they pointed out was that when I was doing the work, I was really limited to the primary sources I could use, because at that time, the Charleston City Archives that had all the minutes of what would be like the city council that discussed these badges and who got the contract to make the badge, all that was unindexed or unorganized archives, and it wasn't until those records became available that they could even do a study like the one that they did. But at the time, though, I actually got criticized by archaeologists for when the papers went to review, a couple of people didn't see the point in doing a study like this. They said, well, this doesn't make any, this isn't an important contribution to understanding urban slavery. And here is just an exhibit showing, or a display showing the various Charleston, the various badges that was on display at the Charleston Museum. When I was doing my study, the only maker of the badges that I was able to identify, and actually for a long time before the book was done by the other authors, was Lafar. And Lafar was a silversmith, and actually a very renowned Charleston silversmith. And I really could never figure out why he was making these badges, but I guess as extra money, extra income. He actually made the badges for the longest period of time. In the monograph that was done by Harlan Green and the two brothers Hutchinson, they were able to find out who had made the badges for much, throughout, except for, I think there's only 2 years where they weren't able to find a record of who made them. But Lafarbe, he actually made badges the longest, from 1810 to 1830, so 20 years, and then again from 18, well, and then one more year, so 21 years he made these badges, and based on the minutes, the contractors would get, well, it varied through time, but it averaged around about $300 that the makers of the badges would get. One concern I did have about doing this project, because I knew when I had started that the badges had become collectible, and since my article and then later even with the book, badges have gotten very electable. If you see in this ad that one went up for auction, I'm not exactly sure when this was, but I think it was like 2015 or something like that. They estimated it would go between $8,000 and $12,000, and it actually sold at $62.50. So I guess I was concerned that I was maybe contributing to this market, having done this research. I don't know. And so it was one reason why I really didn't pursue it any further. Two of the two collectors that worked with Harlan Green, who is a historian and archivist, they did approach me about working with them on this research, because they had told me that they, had found some other records that, would help clarify some of the information that I wasn't able to collect. And, but I was, sort of skeptical, because like I said, I didn't want to necessarily be contributing to a market. And as an archaeologist, the way a lot of these badges are found is from avocational archaeologists using metal detectors and going in backyards in Charleston and other places, or a few have been found on surrounding plantations in the Charleston area, and so that's how most of them are acquired. I mean, a few people have kept them, are items that were curated that people who owned them, acquired at some point, but a lot of them are found from metal detecting, and I didn't want to contribute to that type of hobby. One of the things that I was interested in was the fact that it seems like it would be relatively easy to make forgeries of these badges, and these are two examples. And this was a sort of these 6 points were sort of a guide that I found urging collectors how you can spot a forgery. If it's fully engraved, if the location isn't in Charleston, it's the incorrect shape, or like this one here. I don't. And then it says something like slave auction. I mean, that's not how they were used. They predate 1800 and post-date 1865. So we know also, and that's well documented, that the badges were made between 1800 and 1865. And if they're made from like lead or silver or something like that, they were definitely made from copper. These were two badges that I did actually look at that are in the Charleston collection, and at the time I thought maybe they were forgeries that people at the time made, and that wasn't the case. There actually were badges that were made for the tourist market in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century. And so people were aware of badges, of these slave badges, and someone had actually begun doing sort of like oral histories and trying to find out information about them in 1900. And so, so there was information about the badges, and again, these were intended to be, you know, for tourists and not actually an actual badge that was used. It was, I guess, to replicate what the badges looked like in the 19th century. And then the Charleston neck badges, these were authentic badges. The one on the top is one that I studied, and then this other one I just saw in a collector's publication. And the neck is the northern part of Charleston, not North Charleston, which is a total municipality, not a city today in Charleston, but it was at the very edge. In fact, I grew up in what I guess would be considered the neck in the 19th century. And it was a place where a lot of enslaved people actually lived apart from their slaveholders, which is something that occurred in urban situations in a number of places. And then free badges were the other type of badge, and these were really, well, these are only, this only occurred for like a 6-year period. And the idea was to be able to distinguish free people of color from enslaved people, from runaways or other people that are in the city. The thing you have to remember about Charleston is that it really did have a large black population. And so this is probably one reason why they had the slave hire badges. Maybe it was more important in Charleston than in, you know, maybe some other cities, and so they want to also be able to distinguish free blacks from enslaved people, and so they were required during this 6-year period to get a badge. It doesn't have a year on it. It has the Liberty cap on it, as you can see, and it's possible we don't have too much information on the free badges, and we sort of assume that maybe you got the badge once, but you still had to pay a fee, you know, to a small fee to renew it. And this is just showing the Liberty cap. The free badge and the Hogarth engraving depicting John Wilkes with Liberty cap. So it's the same idea, and used for, I guess, the same, or symbolize the same thing as it did in Rome, the free status of someone who had been formerly enslaved. And while I haven't found any evidence of other places that had free badges for free people, when I was doing this work, someone had written me from North Carolina and sent me this photograph of a slave cloth patch. Apparently in North Carolina, at some point, free people had to wear a cloth patch on their clothing or be made visible somewhere. And a woman came in and brought the cloth patch that her mother or some relative had, and so what they did was to make this, I think it was actually some sort of like a, they made a replica of it, and so he sent me a photograph of it just showing what the cloth patch actually looked like. So moving on to the next object, Moses Smith egg box. This was another object that I found out about while I was at the Charleston Museum. It's made from poplar and white pine, and it was purchased by the Charleston Museum in 1930 for $10. And it was made for the person who ultimately became the ornithologist or an ornithologist for the Charleston Museum to collect his bird eggs. And how we know, the only reason we even know that this was an African American who made this is because the owner wrote in pencil that, he said, Moses Smith, a magnificent colored carpenter without an equal about 1878 or 1879. This case was made for me when I was 15 or 16 years old, in which to keep my birds' eggs. And Arthur Wayne became the ornithologist when he became an adult for the Charleston Museum. And so I've since, and this has been recent, to just find out what I could find out about Moses Smith. He was born on a plantation in Combahee, which is south of, probably about, I guess, an hour or so, hour and a half south of Charleston. And he was possibly an enslaved carpenter on this plantation. And he moved to Charleston in the 1870s after emancipation. And he continued to live in Charleston and worked as a carpenter until his death. On all of the census records, he's identified as a carpenter. This is his death certificate, and he was born in 1840, and so he was 77 when he died. And looking at his death certificate, he's buried in the same cemetery as several of my family members. So that's a personal connection, I guess, I have with Moses Smith. But I'm hoping to find out more about him, looking at some of the slave lists from when, I believe the 1850 and 1860 census have a separate slave list where you can find individuals, so I haven't done that yet. And this is just showing how the egg box was on display for many years in one of the house museums that the Charleston Museum owns. And in the a label, it talks about, it doesn't mention Moses Smith, but they talk about the ornithologist who owned the egg box. And apparently he wasn't a very good, or not very ethical, because he continued to collect birds that were endangered. And so, it says that on the label. But anyway, this is just another example of I guess just the way people were thinking about collections at the time. He died in 1930, and I guess his family sold the box to the Charleston Museum. And then from the Charleston Museum, I actually worked for 3 years at the South Carolina State Museum. And then from there, I went to the Smithsonian Institution, and my first position at the Smithsonian was at the National Museum of American History, where I was hired to what they called the African American Artifact, the African American Index Project. And the idea was I was supposed to actually dig through collections to find African American objects there, because there was a desire to have some sort of finding aid, because they got a lot of requests from people asking about African American objects. And while there are some very well-known examples and well-documented examples of African American art and artifacts at the Smithsonian, like the Harriet Powers Bible quilt, who she made, or two of her quilts have survived. The Smithsonian has one, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has the other. And then Philip Simmons, who was a master blacksmith and iron worker, who is known for his gates. He grew up or was from Charleston, South Carolina, and this is one of the gate that the Smithsonian owns. So the Smithsonian's had a tradition of collecting African American objects, but it was really the earlier ones that I was very interested in finding out about. And in doing that job, I came across what were probably the first objects made by African Americans that the Smithsonian collected, and they collected them from these Southern Black expositions. These were essentially like World's Fairs, but they were, and sometimes they were actually part of a regular World's Fair for both black and white, but the ones in the South, because of Jim Crow segregation, they were in separate buildings. And so these are just a few things that were that survived. Actually, there was a lot of collecting from these expositions by the Smithsonian curators, because I went through their correspondence. But for some reason, though, a lot of it must have gotten thrown out, particularly, I guess, if they were made from organic materials like this horse collar, for example, and some of the other things. I just think that they got tossed at some point, and someone said, "Well, what is this?" and just threw it out. The Smithsonian curators, they were interested in collecting this thing because, unfortunately, they had been highly influenced by scientific racism and evolutionary ideas, and so their plan was to put together an exhibit that would show how black people and Native Americans weren't at the same level of on the evolutionary scale as white Americans. So that was the idea they had in mind. They never actually executed the exhibit. And what I was interested in was, well, how did the black people who made these objects, what were they why did they put them on exhibit, or what did these exhibits, or what did these objects mean for them, and for them to put it on exhibit. And it was basically an effort to just show some of their skills, particularly in what we would think of as the New South. Actually, a lot of times there were white promoters who were sort of encouraging these exhibits by the blacks, so to show that the South had changed, or that was changing. But then they were changing, but at the same time, they were in segregated buildings at the expositions. And anyway, here you have corn husk, horse collar, and a wooden bowl, hand-carved wooden bowl. I mean, they're just simple objects, but for me, I was sort of just intrigued by them, and the fact that they were collected by the Smithsonian, and were some of the first objects that related to African Americans. And then this other object is a invention that was submitted by person Lockram Blue, and it just sort of shows, it just helps to shell remove the kernels from the husk. And then these are just, unfortunately, these images aren't that good. I photographed these from the brochure. I put together a brochure on the exhibits that went with this exhibit case. And, but like this building, which was at the Black Exposition at Jamestown, commemorating the 300th anniversary of Jamestown. So that would have been in like 1907. And this was designed, or this building was designed by a black architect. And then it just sort of shows you the different kinds of objects and how they were displayed at these fairs. I have more time than I thought. And then the final object that I want to look at is actually, when I was at the South Carolina State Museum, I was there, like I said, after leaving the Charleston Museum and then going to the South Carolina State Museum for about 3 years. And at that time, it was essentially a paper museum. I mean, it hadn't really opened yet. We were planning the State Museum, and I was hired as the historical researcher. And again, my role was to do background research for exhibits, actually write exhibit scripts, and also document objects. And and this picture I'm showing of the South Carolina State Museum, it was placed in a 19th century textile mill. And so it was totally renovated and retooled to be a museum. And the museum actually opened after I had left to go to the Smithsonian. But I think my all-time favorite object is the Roots canoe. It's, in some ways, we don't know for sure that it was made by African Americans. We have no way of knowing. It was the Roots canoe. The Roots canoe was a canoe that someone, probably maybe a couple of people, started building out of cypress, out of a fallen cypress tree. And you can see these, the knees are the roots of the cypress right there, and then here they are, carving it. But they had to abandon it because crack developed on the stern, and so, all that effort they put into making this dugout was, wasted, so to speak. I mean, they couldn't use it. And I don't know, I just was fascinated by this object. I'm not sure why. I guess I feel like there's a story there about, two people trying to build a canoe and then having put in some effort, but ultimately had to abandon it because the wood broke. But I recently used it in an article, an introduction to a series of articles in slavery and abolition that dealt with maritime marinage being, the running enslaved people who ran away from plantations or from slavery, but went by sea as opposed to, over land. And of course, a lot of this happened in the Caribbean, and I'll talk more about that on tomorrow's, Sunday. And so what I was suggesting in this introductory thing about maritime marinage or enslaved people running away via waterways was the fact that they possibly were making some sort of crafts, watercrafts, and this seems like a likely way that they would go about doing it is maybe choosing a fallen tree as opposed to actually cutting down a tree. In the Caribbean, for example, for St. Croix, in one of the papers in this collection, the author pointed out how the enslaved people were building all these canoes and running away, that they actually had to pass a statute, pointing out that, this was illegal and that they would be punished. I don't know if it really stopped it, but it may have curtailed some people from doing it. So it was a real problem. And this particular canoe was found under water, originally first by hobbyists, and then later they brought in skilled underwater archaeologists, and they retrieved it. This was back in the 70s. And the plan was for the museum to, once it was built, to use the canoe in the plantation exhibit, because it certainly fits within the kinds of canoes that were being used and being built on plantations. And where they found it was in a plantation, it was in the Waccamaw River, but it was near the plantation areas along the Waccamaw. But, we would have to do some, it's possible. I looked into the possibility of if we could do dendrochronology on it to find out, because if it's 19th century, chances are that it was probably made by enslaved people. If it's older, then it could well have been made by Native Americans. So we don't know who built it, but it just is, to me, just such a fascinating object. So I'd like to thank all the people who've helped me with these various projects.
That was lovely. Thank you very, very much.